Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our Grow Native webinar, Skippers in Your Backyard, What Are They? With Dawn Weber. The Grow Native program is a native plant marketing and education program that serves the lower Midwest, and that's run by the Missouri Prairie Foundation. My name is Brooke Widmar. I'm the Director of Administrative Operations and Member Engagement for the Foundation, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I also want to take a moment to recognize and thank the Grow Native sponsors listed here on the screen. Their support makes educational events like this one possible for everyone. During the presentation today and during the Q&A session, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your Zoom screen. And when Dawn is done presenting, Carol will ask her your questions. So you know the webinar is being recorded, so the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow if you miss a part of it or want to rewatch it, along with any resources mentioned during the webinar and during the Q&A session. So to introduce today's speaker, when Dawn Weber is not working at her job as a data analyst, she spends most of her time in her St. Louis native garden habitat, studying, photographing, and enjoying all of the life that it supports. She is currently vice president of the St. Louis chapter of Wild Ones. That's a national organization that builds communities that educate and encourage the use of native plants in the landscape for the benefit of wildlife and people. The Wild Ones motto is healing the earth one yard at a time, and Dawn enjoys her yard and enjoys sharing her yard and knowledge with others to inspire them to take their first step towards healing their little piece of the earth. So without further ado, take it away, Dawn.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me. I haven't done this presentation before, so I'm hoping it's going to go well and that everything makes sense, because it made sense to me when I wrote it. So, skippers in your backyard, what are they? I don't know if you've even noticed them. They move pretty fast and you might not catch them, but they are the cutest furry little creatures that I know. So when most people think of skippers, they're thinking about Gilligan and the Skipper, or maybe Barbie and Skipper, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. We are going to talk about these skippers, and they're kind of in between a butterfly and a moth. You'll see they kind of look a little more like moths, but they act like butterflies. And they're called skippers because they're really fast and direct and have short flights that make them look like they're skipping across the landscape. And these are just a few of the skippers that we may look at. All the skipper photos in the presentation are all from my yard except one that's marked. So I live in St. Louis City, and I have a 1/4 acre of land, and I have about 5,000 square feet of native plantings and habitat. And I really enjoy going out and looking at all of the things that show up in the yard and taking photos of them, because I like to think that it'll inspire people to do some of the same actions. So, how are they like a moth? Well, their head and their small stout body resemble that of a moth. So if we look kind of here along these lines, they really look like moths, but they fly during the day, and the antennae are clubbed mostly that make them look more like a butterfly. They used to be classified as their own group, but they now are part of the butterflies. So some of the features of skippers: their muscular body and short wings give them the ability to take off very quickly and maneuver well to avoid predators. They're very fast. They have a very long proboscis that lets them get nectar from very deep inside the flowers. This tube is the proboscis, and they roll it up because it's so long. They never glide like a butterfly does, and they can reach speeds up to more than 20 miles an hour. I guess if they're, getting away from somebody. So when can you see them? You can see them in Missouri anytime from March through November, but it depends on the species and the weather that we're having. Once it gets cold, they really aren't visible that much more. So for each species we're going to talk about, I'll have this timeline across the part of the screen that'll show you when that skipper is flying. So where can you see skippers? You might find them near water. Some of them like to be near water, in and at the edge of woodlands, in overgrown fields, in gardens, in prairies, and in other open areas. Today, I've kind of kept the focus on ones that are in the garden. And I haven't gotten all of them in here. So there's still more to be talked about another time. What do adult skippers use for food? Like butterflies, they take flower nectar from annuals and perennials, but also from tree and shrub flowers. And I think sometimes we don't think about those as much when we think about flowers. So if you're planting food for skippers, for adult skippers, you want to aim for a continuous bloom throughout the growing season so that there's always something there for them. And you want to choose a lot of plants that have different colors and shapes because different ones are attracted to different flowers. Some skippers puddle, which means that they use their proboscis to suck up nitrogen and sodium from different things like soil and sand and gravel, or even dung and carrion. So people think butterflies are pretty and all these things, but they have some questionable habits, right? So my favorite nectar plant for skippers, and it is a native plant because we're all here about grow native, is the aromatic aster. It's blooming right now. It has a shrubby shape as opposed to some of the other asters. And you can cut it back in July so that it stays a little more compact. The only drawback to it is that it reseeds pretty readily. So sometimes it's best to cut those flower heads off when they're done blooming. This plant in October is loaded with skippers and bees and wasps looking for snacks. But it is the hot spot of the yard, and it's the last thing to bloom. So the life cycle of the butterfly and the skipper is the same. So you have the egg that is laid by the adult female, which hatches and becomes a larva. Then you have the larva will go into a pupa state where it's going to turn into an adult. And you'll see that in two of these pictures, there's a plant behind the subject, and those are the host plants. So not everybody might be familiar with what a host plant is. So a host plant is the group of plants or the plant that butterfly and moth eggs can be laid on because they'll provide food for the caterpillars, which will then become adult butterflies and moths that will repeat the cycle. Not any plant can be a host plant because the insects and the plants over many, many years have developed relationships that take significant time to build. And so the caterpillars will adapt to the toxins in a certain plant so that they can eat it. And so not just any plant can be a host plant. And by planting host plants and nectar plants, we're supporting all of the stages of that skipper and butterfly. And so skipper really need those native plants to complete their life cycle. They're so important. So on the way to being an adult, they hatch, and then those tiny caterpillars are going to make nests like this, where they strategically silk together the edges of blades of grass or leaves by cutting away a portion of the leaf and then pulling it over. So here I have a silver spotted skipper caterpillar that's using a wisteria leaf in the yard. And I noticed that there was a little one that was folded over. And so I pulled it open just enough to take a picture so that I could see what was going on in there. And then we left that one to continue its journey. They do leave their shelter and eat grass, leaves, and plants nearby. And they also exit the nest in order to launch their frass or poop. That's a little different than moths. Moths apparently don't do that. So that's one way that they're different. Other fun facts about skippers: they can be very hard to tell apart. So if you start to notice them and you find that you're struggling to figure out which one it is, you are not alone. It can be challenging. There are some books to help, and we'll talk about those at the end. Skippers can be dimorphic, which means that the male and female have a different appearance. And I've got a couple examples of that further down in the presentation. The males of most species locate mates by perching and watching, although some will patrol an area to look for those, but especially the spread wing skippers, and we'll get to what those are shortly. Male skippers have pheromone producing scales referred to as stigma that are found in these forewing patches. There's one here in this photo, and that's what's used to attract the ladies. Do skippers migrate? So we know that some butterflies migrate, like the monarch and maybe some sulfurs. Most of our skippers are residents here. They live here year round and they overwinter as a pupa or a larva. We do have a few that are called immigrants. So they're not a migrant because they're not going a round trip. They are immigrants because they are mostly found in the south and the southwest. And they move into our area during the warmer weather and they establish a breeding population. But then once that first frost comes, they're going to perish. And then the next year, the ones from the south will move north again. We have a couple of those. Those are fun. How many species of skippers are there? So globally, I had to look this up. There are about 3,500 species of skippers. That is a lot. In North America, north of Mexico, so in Canada and the US, we have about 250 to 300 species of skippers. In Missouri, we have about 60 that were documented in the various resources that I use today. And then in my landscape, I've seen 13. So the pieces of the pie are, globally, North America, the gray is Missouri, and this tiny little yellow sliver is what I've gotten to see. So there are two kinds of skippers. They fall into two pretty big classes for what we have in Missouri. The first are the spread wing or the open wing skippers, and they're pretty large. They generally land with their wings held flat out to the sides. You will rarely see them folded up so that you can see the lower surface of the wings, and they're usually black, brown, or checkered. So here we've got one here that's that brown with some flakes and spots. The other kind are called grass skippers or closed wing skippers. They are relatively small, and their forewings are often held open in a V shape, while the hind wings are held out horizontally flat to the sides. They are usually what people like to call the little jet plane skippers, and they're usually orange or tan. So now we're going to get into some of these skippers that you can find in your own yards. So the first one is the silver spotted skipper, and it's found in many places. So it's found in woodland edges, overgrown fields, disturbed areas, gardens, and prairies. It's the largest skipper because it's 1.5 inches to 2 inches large, 2.5 inches large, where you'll see that a lot of the grass skippers are about 1 inch. So these guys really stand out when you see them flying through your space. For the caterpillar food, they use woody legumes. And I've got a slide that shows what some of those things are. And then their adult food source is all of the things. So it's the flowers and the mud and the damp sand and the gravel. They fly here from about April through mid-October, and they overwinter as a pupa. The silver spotted skipper is one that I've actually had the pleasure of seeing kind of go through the whole life cycle. And so the picture on the left is actually a silver spotted skipper egg. Now, that egg is so tiny, it's smaller than a grain of rice. And the only reason you can find it very easily, unless you're look through all the leaves, the backs of the leaves on the plant, is that you watch when they lay them. And then you try to remember, okay, it was one of those leaves in that area. And then you have just a few to look through. The picture on the right is actually a silver spotted skipper caterpillar that has made that leaf structure fold over and pull shut. This one I also just pried open just a little bit so that I could see how large it was in there. So the host plants for the silver spotted skipper, it has quite a few. It's more of a generalist. So trees like honey locust and black locust, shrubs like lead plants, perennials like wild senna, and even wisteria vine, which we hope that you have the native wisteria vine. But even wisteria will host those silver spotted skippers. So the next one is the Horace's dusky wing. And it tends to be found more in woodlands and in gardens, not so much prairies or near water or some of those other things. So its caterpillar food source is oak and chestnut, and it's also been found using wisteria. But I will say that some documentations of caterpillars on plants might be questionable because we don't know if they actually saw the caterpillar eating the plant or if it was just found there. So the wisteria is one that I found in the resources, but I'm not sure about that one. So the dusky wing, Horace's dusky wing, is one that will use the carrion and dung in addition to all the others. And here you'll see this one is an inch-ish to an inch and a half-ish. So it's an inch smaller than silver spotted skippers. It overwinters as a larva, and you can see these almost all during the growing season. It's a pretty long band. Similar to Horace's is a wild indigo dusky wing. It's found in woodlands, gardens, and prairies. And as you might guess, its larval food source is wild indigo, which is a perennial as opposed to being some of the more woody plants. The wingspan on the wild indigo dusky wing is an inch to an inch and a half, and it overwinters as a larva. And you'll see that it's mostly an April through maybe mid-October one that you can see. This one I have seen in the yard, but my friend Kathy Bildner, who lives not that far from me, found one of the Baptisia larvae on a Baptisia plant in her garden. So I asked her if we could use her photo because that's pretty cool. And it's got a really like almost flag-shaped head. I really want to see one of those in person. So the dusky wing host plants are Baptisias, and we have great Baptisias in Missouri. We have the false blue indigo, we have white false indigo, and we have the cream wild indigo. They are all beautiful plants, and they're great for bumblebees too. Bumblebees will pry open those flowers and get inside. It's pretty cool. Right. So we've got the Commer checkered skipper. This is one that I waited a long time to see in my yard. After probably only after 6 years of watching, I was able to see one of these in the yard. It was a pretty exciting day. They're found in a lot of different habitats, and their food source is grasses. So you might be thinking, grasses, could you be any more specific? And unfortunately, no, in a lot of cases. They're generalists and they use grasses. So the common checkered skipper is an inch to an inch and a third. So they're on the smaller side of the spread wing skippers. They overwinter as larvae, but they can be seen into November if the weather is right. So then we have one of my favorites, the fiery skipper. So now we're into the grass skippers because it's a little orange guy. They're found in a lot of different habitats, and they also just use grasses. And they're in that inch to inch and a half range, but you'll see that they're less visible in the spring months. And that's because this is one that immigrates from the south every year. So they hatch in the south, then they move north and they stay here, and then they're gone and they come back next year. But they have teddy bear-like faces to me. And this is the easiest one of the little grass skippers to identify. They're the fastest, and they're really, those spots only really happen on fiery skippers. So the next one is the sachem, also found in a lot of different areas, same inch to inch and a half. This one also immigrates from the south. And here you can see a little bit of that sexual dimorphism where, you know, the male and the female have different looks. The male is, I believe that's the male, is darker and has more white blotches. Actually, I think it's the other way. I think the bottom one is the male and the top one is the female. The sachems are unique because they have kind of a gray face. That's what makes them the easiest to pick out. And they're another one that immigrates from the south. So when we talk about native grasses as host plants, these are some of the top 10 native grasses. So we've got little blue stem and cytosgrama and big blue stem and prairie dropseed and switchgrass. The Grow Native Plant Database is one of the best around. So you can just go and say, hey, I want to see some grasses, and you'll get a list with pictures and lots of great information. So always use that database. So then moving on, we've got the Pex skipper. The Pex is pretty easy to identify because of these kind of light colored, they're almost stripes. They're pretty easy to pick out. They have a lot of habitats too. They have grasses, but they also eat something called rice cutgrass. That's not really a commercial, put it in your garden native. But I thought it was interesting that I found one that actually listed a specific plant. And these are about an inch. They don't have a lot of size variation, and they can overwinter as a larva or a pupa. And they come out in May and probably disappear around the end of October. So now is a pretty good time to see them. We have the Delaware skipper. The Delaware is a little plainer, not so much fanciness going on the wings. This is one of the few that's found near wet areas. Oops. This one is grasses also, but specifically in more than one book, I saw big blue stem and switchgrass called out for this one. So if you have those plants around, take a look. You might find some Delaware skippers. This one's a little on the slightly larger side because it can get up to an inch and a half. It overwinters as a larva. And it's got a little bit of a shorter viewing time in comparison to some of the others. Then one of my favorites, because I love this fringy white edge, it's the Zabulon skipper. Their habitats are a little more limited, mostly woodlands, gardenlands, and prairies. Here also I found some specific grasses. Purple top and love grass were some ones that were specifically called out. They overwinter as a larva, and here they're like end of April through beginning of October. They are really pretty. The tawny edge skipper is our next one. I actually didn't realize that I had this skipper in my yard, but I had taken a lot of photos and I loaded them to iNaturalist, and someone helped me identify what these were. And I was really excited to get another one to add to my list. This one also listed big blue stem and switchgrass as being host plants. And I was just really surprised about that one. Then I think this might be the last one, the dun skipper. See how it's a little more brown than the others where maybe they were orange and tan. This one's another one that's found near wet areas. And because it's found near wet areas, it uses sedges as its host plant. So that's the only one like that that we talked about today. So it's a little shorter season, mid-May through maybe mid-October. And it's really unique looking. When we go outside of kind of these common ones, there are a lot of these little brown ones that have various flecks that are, they're called roadside skippers that are pretty hard to identify. But I got more help on this one from iNaturalist. So native sedges as host plants. Globe sedge is a great one for rain gardens. Short sedge I have in my woodland. Oak sedge is very popular. It's kind of the woodland version of prairie dropseed, except a little smaller. Palm sedge and cedar sedge. I love sedges. I have a lot of shade, so sedges work out for me. So what can I do for skippers? You can plant native plants, as we talked about. You can remove invasive plants because that always gives native plants a little more room to shine. You can skip using pesticides in your space. And then don't be too tidy when you have a landscape when you're looking at your landscape, either cleaning up in the fall or the spring, because some of these overwinter in that leaf litter that you might be tempted to clean up, or maybe they've attached to a plant stem that if you take that plant stem and toss it, you're tossing that skipper. So please consider all of that when you're thinking about your spring cleanup. So I'm just wrapping up. There are 3 books that I used when I was doing this presentation. The first one is an older book called The Field Guide to Skipper Butterflies of Illinois. Illinois and Missouri have a lot of overlap. And I really like that book, and they're supposed to be making a new version of it someday, and I look forward to that. My other favorite book is The Photographic Field Guide to Butterflies of Kansas City. The pictures in that book are fantastic because there's multiple pictures of each of the species. And it's my favorite reference that I recommend all the time. It's a little hard to find, but Betsy sells them off of Amazon. I hope she's been able to get her store back up and running. And then the last one that I used, which is also a little older, is The Butterflies and Moths of Missouri, because I was curious to see what differences I might find between the 3 sources. If you start finding these in your landscape and you want to know what they are, there's kind of 2 ways to do that. One is that I'm one of the admins for a Facebook group called Bi-State Bugs, where we have a community of, I think, maybe 7,000 people that post pictures of insects, either because they're super excited about what they found or they don't know what it is that they found and they want some help. iNaturalist.org is another way to help get some identification on photos. That can be a little challenging depending on the time of the year, because all those folks who know about what those are out doing field work, but it can suggest to you what your thing might be, and then you can, with those limited choices, you can narrow it down if someone doesn't come along and help you out. So that is the end of my subject of skippers for today. It looks like we do have questions.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dawn. This is Carol David. I'm with the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and I'll, we do have quite a few questions, and I'll relay them to you from the chat and the Q&A. And I think some things you did mention, but we may have just missed a few things. And there was a question about I think it was the slide right before your resources slide. Someone asked, is this a fiery skipper? So it was the one.
This one.
Yes.
Yes, that one's a fiery because it's got the dots.
Okay, great. A couple questions. Just, I know you showed the photo of the silver spotted skipper egg that was by itself. Do they lay in? Do all skippers lay individual eggs, or do they lay them in clusters?
I think that most of them are individual. As I was looking through the books, especially the photographic guide, it has that in there for each species, and most of them are individual.
Okay, thank you. And you talked about the differences between butterflies, moths, and skippers. And but now skippers were their own group, but now you say they are considered within the butterflies. Is that correct?
That's correct. They changed that.
And there's
scientists are always regrouping things.
Yeah. And then you mentioned about how there can be the closed wing skippers, or the ones with the wings held back. And Sharon asked, she thought that the wing holding pattern was what distinguished them from butterflies. So how would you really tell an open wing skipper from a butterfly, or from other kinds of butterflies?
It is hard. So, here in this photo, this one is the flat. So that's how the spread wings are different, because you don't see them doing that a lot. But the skippers are tiny little orange guys, the grass skippers, and those are the ones that are always going to have their wings up. Let's see if we can go back. Yeah, this guy.
Okay.
See how he kind of has some out, and then these guys are up, and they kind of look like they make almost a little V. The grass skippers tend to do this.
So for the photo of the open, are you saying that butterflies usually are not that flat? The open wing skippers, when they're open, they're flatter than other kinds of butterflies?
I think so, but that might be just my opinion.
Okay. And so in terms of the antenna, you mentioned the skippers are club shaped. Are they any different from other kinds of butterflies? Would you call there's a comment here that they're a bit hooked.
Let's see what we can find. I'm gonna pull this picture and make it larger, because that may help. So here you can see that it's not like a moth antenna, but it's clubbed on the end, but here it's got that little hook. Skippers are gonna have that for the most part.
That little hook, but the other butterfly groups would not have the hook.
They would just be a clubbed end.
Very good. Great. Well, Juliana pointed that out. Thank you very much. When you're talking about the grass skippers feeding on those various species of native grasses, do any of them feed on like the grass we have in our lawns?
Some of them do, that's for sure. There's references to crabgrass and Bermuda grass and all kinds of other things that, you really wouldn't necessarily expect, but I guess they've adapted with those. And so
when we're cutting grass, some of those, if there are caterpillars there feeding, then they could be harmed then when cutting grass.
They could be.
Yeah.
Well, and the same kind of goes for the violets in your lawn when you mow, and you might be mowing over some fritillary butterflies that use the violets as a host plant. So
Yeah.
it's a great reason to not mow high
Mhm.
if you can.
Yeah, good point. There's a question here. Do skippers eat pollen as well as nectar?
I did not read about that in my research. It's a very good question though that I'd have to go out and look up to see if there are any examples of that.
If the proboscis is their only mechanism for feeding, would the proboscis be able to take up pollen? Or would they have another way of eating?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I think I'm less familiar with their physical attributes.
Always something more to learn.
That's right.
Regarding some more questions about kind of their life cycle. You mentioned that you've only seen them lay one egg at a time. Do you know how often they lay eggs? Is it one a day? Is it one a week? Is it, how many in a month or a lifetime? And what is the lifespan?
I do not know. That is something I should have covered. I really don't quite know the answer to that. I mean, most adults will live obviously less than a year, because if they're not migrating away, they're going to be here at some point during the spring, and then when the frost comes, that will sort of be the end of them. I don't know how many eggs they will lay at a time. I've seen a silver spotted skipper lay probably 6 or 7 on one plant in different places.
Mhm.
They do sometimes have more than one kind of brood, where some of them really only have one egg laying period, but some of the others have multiple. It's really dependent on the species.
Very good. Well, we might all do some internet or book research and try to learn more about that. Thank you.
That's right.
And you mentioned about skippers moving south, and there's a question about overwintering. I was curious how, and forgive me if you mentioned this, how far south are we talking? Are you, how far south are they going? The ones that we enjoy here during the growing season?
The couple that actually are the immigrant type, I don't know what their winter range is. I would assume it's somewhere that doesn't get cold enough that, they're gonna perish. So pretty far south.
Okay. But within the US, like Georgia or someplace like
I
that?
would think so.
Mhm.
But I can look at some range maps and see if I can find some winter range maps for those.
Okay, thank you. And we can also Brooke sends an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of your presentation. And we can include those references or those resources that you had a slide of. And Dawn also wrote a really nice article with her wonderful photos on skippers for the Missouri Prairie Journal a few years ago, and we'll include a link to that article as well. There's a couple questions here about there's a lot of compliments to you on both on your presentation and on your wonderful photos. Question, really great pictures of these tiny critters. What camera equipment are you usually shooting with?
So a lot of the skipper photos were taken with a Canon 7D digital camera. It's a DSLR, so it has lenses that you can swap out. And most of those were done before I even got a macro lens. So I was sort of using an extension tube, which puts distance between the camera and the lens that allows you to get closer to the insects. Now I would use a macro lens. I found that having good equipment does make a difference for skippers, because you need to be able to have a fast shutter speed to keep them from being blurred. And even having a flash helps to just freeze their motion.
Thank you. And any other tips on like the best time to photograph them, and also the best time to observe them in the daytime? So best time to observe them, and also maybe best time or other tips for photographing them.
For me, it's the afternoons when it's warm, but the challenge with that is sometimes when it's warm, it can be a little windy. And if there's any wind, it's really hard to take photos of them, but they should be out there and you should be able to see them. You might even try close range binoculars so that you can get a little better view of them, but without being quite so close. They're not super skittish. Like, if you approach the plant, they probably won't fly away. If they do, a lot of times they'll come back. So you just have to kind of wait it out. But when I have skippers around in the yard, I usually have lots of them. So
Thank you.
just pick a new one.
There's some tips here. We've got many avid lepidopterists here today. And Lynn mentions regarding the eggs that Betsy Betros's book about Kansas City, it lists if eggs are single or clustered and how many broods per year. So that would be a good thing to look up. So that's great information. And Pat mentions, in regard to being able to differentiate skippers from other butterfly groups, Pat says, don't skippers always have large eyes that we don't notice in other butterflies? They do.
That is true.
So that's another way to help differentiate them from other butterfly groups, is the larger eyes. One other question about when they're noticeable. Do they also come out after dark, the skippers?
I think maybe a couple of times I've seen a skipper come to a moth sheet, but generally I think no. It's mostly daylight.
Okay, thank you. And where do larvae, for the ones that overwinter as larvae, where do they overwinter so they don't die of the cold?
That was one thing that I wanted to look up and learn a little bit more about, but I didn't get a chance. I know that some of them will just wrap up in a leaf and that it's attached to a plant stem, which seems kind of like that wouldn't be very warm and overwintering. But I believe that some of them will go into, leaves and detritus and, things on the floor of the landscape.
Yeah, it is amazing how things do survive. I mean, I'm sure some things don't survive, but another good reason for leaving the leaves in your flower beds over winter is that there are a lot of creatures there carrying out their life cycles there in the winter. A couple more questions here. How do you create a, quote, puddle for skippers?
I think I've seen directions where you can take some soil and sand and mix it together and add some salt to it. And then it just needs to stay moist so that they can use it.
All right, thank you. Question here, or there's some information here that they produce an antifreeze type of chemical within their bodies, and they overwinter in leaf litter as well as on tree and shrub branches. So that's good to know.
There you go. Thank you.
And another person here says, in our yard, the skippers really like to nectar on vine milkweed. So I'm assuming that's the honey vine. It's not in the Asclepias genus. It's a Cynancum laevi. So that's good to know. Yep. Also, a question about how do controlled burns affect skippers? Like a controlled burn on a prairie or a prairie planting.
That is something I don't know the answer to.
I can offer that with the Missouri Prairie Foundation. Of course, we burn all of our prairie remnants and prairie reconstructions when they're established. We burn 1/3 to 1/2 of each tract every year. The reason we do just 1/3 to 1/2 is so that we are not killing all overwintering insects that might be there. So there are
Right.
native bees that are nesting in some stems, and there are regal fritillary butterfly caterpillars. Wait, I think they overwinter as a larva, that we don't obviously want to harm. But on the flip side, so then you could say, well, why burn it all? But if we don't burn it all, then we can't perpetuate other species that some of those very insects depend on. So, so yes, if you burn and it's a very clean, quote, clean burn, and it's a very hot burn, and it just, consumes everything, it most likely will be consuming insects in leaf litter. So another thing that can be done is to burn at night or evening, higher humidity, and have a spottier burn that doesn't burn quite as hot. And so it still could, of course, kill insects in litter, in leaf litter, but it might spare more. So that's another thing to consider. There's some really good information here going back to the question about pollen versus nectar. Jane says, and this is about zebra longwing butterflies, but this might be helpful. Zebra longwing butterflies collect pollen on the outside of their proboscis and excrete stomach acids through the proboscis onto the gathered pollen. After the process of external digestion is complete, the zebra longwing drinks down the liquefied protein that is rich in nutrients. This special diet allows the zebra longwing butterfly to live a whopping 6 to 9 months as an adult butterfly. Wow.
Thank
That's
you.
incredible. Thank you, Jane, for that fascinating information. Let's see here. I think we might have gotten to all of the questions. Let me just make sure I haven't missed any here. I think that might be it. Oh, let's see. I have one other question. So I think that those are all the questions, and thank you everybody for your very nice remarks, and so many kudos to you, Dawn, for a wonderful presentation, and for all of the work that you have done, Dawn, to educate people about native landscaping through the hard work that you have put in on your own property and how you've documented it and shared it with others. It's really a gift, and we're so grateful to you for your knowledge and your observations about native plants and interactions of skippers and other creatures with native plants. And with that, I think that I think we've answered all the questions, and thank you so much, Dawn. Thanks everybody for joining us, and look for an email tomorrow sometime from Brooke with a link to Dawn's wonderful presentation. So thank you all very much, and have a good evening.